Hey, everybody, welcome to our live stream. We're starting early today. Normally, we start late, but we're starting early today because we have a special guest in the house tonight with us. So it's Chris Hedges is here, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, Chris. How are you? Thanks for being our guest.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Let me just tell everybody who Chris is. If you're not familiar with him, he's a journalist, Presbyterian minister, a visiting Princeton University lecturer. His books include War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, Death of the Liberal Class, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, written with cartoonist Joe Sacco, which was the New York Times bestseller, and his most recent, Wages of Rebelling, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. Well, this is actually his most recent. It's the America, the Farewell Tour. I don't know if you could see that, if the line, but we'll put it up. America, the Farewell Tour, which I just got done reading. And just so people know a little bit more about you, you're a columnist for the progressive and commentary website Truth Dig, where I read most of your stuff. He's also a host for the television program On Contact on RT. He spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, West Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. He has reported for more than 50 countries and has worked for the Christian Science Monitor, NPR, Dallas Morning News, the New York Times, where he was a foreign correspondent for 15 years. And in 2001, he contributed to the New York Times staff entry that received the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. And he also received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism in 2002. So that is pretty impressive. Nobody, I don't think, actually frames where we're at as a society better than you do. And I read you and I listen to your speeches, so it makes me very unpopular on news shows. So I just want to say thank you for being here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I love the story of, I don't know if you want to tell it, but how you knew you wanted to be a war correspondent. Do you remember the story?
I remember that story. That's a long story. You want me to tell it?
Oh, you can shorten it up.
Okay.
You're good. Just get to the good part. You're being chased. You're with this girl.
Right. So I was fired from an unpaid internship on the House Foreign Affairs Committee because it was under the Carter presidency. It was just I was in college, and I was investigating how Gulf and Western, which is now morphed into the Trump Tower in New York, was breaking labor unions in the Dominican Republic by murdering the labor union leaders who were being found in ditches. So 2 vice presidents from Gulf and Western came in, got me fired from my unpaid internship, and I hitchhiked. I went around and collected $210 from all the other interns, hitchhiked to Florida, flew to the Dominican Republic, and I had basic Spanish, but not good enough to finish the story, which I wanted to finish and publish. And I walked out of I arranged through my church connections to stay in a dormitory for Haitian cane cutters run by the Episcopal Church. I walked out. I run into an American. She introduces herself as Mrs. Camaño. And I said, Camaño? You mean like Francisco Camaño, who, after the Marines invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965, went to Cuba and got a rebel force like Che, landed, and the U.S. Rangers hunted him down and killed him. Told her, and so she hooked me up with her daughter, who, now I was like 20. Her daughter was in her 30s. She's come back from New Jersey where she got divorced. And we go out to these sweatshops where people are, as they are in any sweatshop, working under horrendous conditions. And at a certain point, I was taking pictures. They were beating some of the workers with these big truncheons, and they started chasing me. But I'd been a college runner. I'd been a really good track runner, and they couldn't get me. But I'm darting through the grass, and I think her name was Liliana. She was driving up and down between the sweatshops, screaming out the window, "Don't touch him, I'm a Camaño." And then it started raining. I made a run for it. I jumped in a car. We drove back towards Santo Domingo, and maybe an hour outside the city, we stopped in one of these shacks that sold beer and drank quite a bit of beer, and got out in the parking lot, and the rain had stopped, and you had that kind of feral vegetation with the steam. And I'm standing right next to her in the car, and She says, "Did I ever tell you I have a tattoo?" I said, "No." She said, "Would you like to see it?" I said, "Sure." And she unzipped her pants and had this little butterfly tattoo. And it was at that moment I knew I wanted to be a foreign correspondent.
One of the great all-time stories. So in your book, America, the Farewell Tour, people are always asking me, what is neoliberalism? Why is it so bad? Well, I never really have what I consider to be a good, succinct answer for them. And it's never satisfying for either of us. Would it be correct to say another term for it would be corporate capitalism is what you talk about in your book? Is that a close, or just tell people what you think how corporate capitalism is?
Well, corporate capitalism is about the destruction of democratic institutions and national economies to enrich a tiny cabal, a global oligarchic corporate elite. Neoliberalism is the utopian ideology that was created to justify the massive social inequality and misery and destruction of social service programs, right down through public education. So this is something Karl Marx got. Every ruling ideology, every ruling class creates an ideology to justify their own privilege, their own elitism, and their own right to hoard wealth, resources, and power at the expense of everyone else. So you had the divine right of kings. Louis XVI was still trying to make this claim in the tennis court. The famous, when they walked out of the National Assembly that precipitated the French Revolution. You had systems like communism and fascism that elevated a certain elite. In the case of fascism, it was racial. In the case of communism, it was class. It's all there. So corporate capitalism uses neoliberalism, but it's an ideology that makes no sense economically. The whole idea, there's nothing in 4,000 years of settled society to convincingly argue that by enriching your oligarchic class, this is good for the economy or good for the working class. We know that it isn't. But we got spun this lie, courtesy of these courtiers, these kind of intellectual courtiers, Leo Strauss, others, and all the useful idiots like Greenspan and everybody else. But as a rational ideology, it was always absurd that you should make your entire society kneel before the dictates of the marketplace, and that the primacy of the marketplace should determine how you structure your government, your culture. And those who criticize neoliberalism, I'm going back to Sheldon Wolin, who was our greatest contemporary political philosopher. They were ruthlessly shut out. Wolin wrote the book Democracy Incorporated. I highly recommend it, where he uses the term inverted totalitarianism to describe our system. But once he started calling out neoliberalism for the con that it was, he and the other critics were purged from the universities, purged from the mass media, and so we were.
So let me just you put it very, and I'm already forgetting how you said it, but the neoliberalism is that your society should kneel in front of the dictates of the free market or the market.
Right.
And that everything should come from the free market. So
and that the free market is somehow equatable with democracy.
Yes, so that's a big mistake that a lot of people make. That
it's antithetical to democracy completely.
Free market is.
Yeah.
Yeah, how so?
Well, we've seen it. It's destroyed democracy. It's destroyed open society around the globe. It's why we are watching these troglodyte proto-fascists rise up, Viktor Orban or Nigel Farage in England or Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, or the when a tiny cabal seizes power, whether it's monarchical, communist, fascist, or in our case, corporate, and it captures the mechanisms and the institutions that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible, to redirect all resources, all power, and all wealth towards this cabal, then it eviscerates an open society, because as the American population is pushed further and further into distress, probably 60% of this country lives in severe distress, it uses harsher and harsher forms of control. I mean, one of the interesting things about this moment in American history is that this peculiar ideology no longer has any credibility across the political spectrum, right or left. And so that's why the ruling elites, I know you've done a lot on voter suppression, voter fraud, are using a variety of mechanisms, of which voter suppression is one, to ensure that the anger that is now rippling through the American landscape is never expressed in a way that can remove them from power. I mean, that you fix electoral politics, and the Democratic Party, as I know you have been one of the few to point out, is as culpable as the Republican Party in doing this.
Yeah. So you're saying it's not Susan Sarandon?
It's no, and it's not Vladimir Putin either.
I thought all our problems were caused by Russia meddling, or Susan Sarandon, or a combination.
No, it's called the Democratic Party of New York State.
So I wanted to start off differently. I'm so stupid I screwed up. But because I wanted you to tell the story about how you came to not work for the New York Times anymore. And I saw a videotape of you giving a commencement speech, and people started to boo because you were telling the truth about the Iraq War. And there were a lot of people who didn't want to hear it. And
well, that was most of the crowd.
And they started to boo and yell.
Well, they stood up and started singing "God Bless America" to drown me out.
During your speech?
Yeah, and then they cut the mic twice.
And then...
It was my first and last invitation to give a commencement address.
So it was so bad that, your suit coat was in the president's office.
No, it was my jacket.
Your jacket?
So I had one of those academic gowns.
Oh, right.
And so at the end, it's on YouTube. There's kind of a
I saw it.
Right.
It's great.
These two guys from the graduating class get up and try and literally push me off the podium. So campus security is freaking out, and they don't want me seated up there while the students come to collect their diplomas, because they're worried that some of the students will attack me.
Right.
So they come before they begin the awarding of diplomas. The security comes and tells me that they're going to take me off campus. And I said, but my coat, it's in the president's office. They said, we'll mail you your coat, which they did. I have to say they did mail it to me. And so then they drove me to my hotel room while I got my suitcase, and then drove me to the bus station and put me on a bus to Chicago. That was it. And the next day, the Rockford Star Register, whatever the paper is, had a banner headline that said, "Speaker disrupts Rockford graduation." That's American press at its best.
So now the New York Times gets wind of this, and
well, what happened was, I mean, the Times I've been 15 years at the Times, so, I don't know that they were hugely surprised that I was running around. I had been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I'd been 7 years in the Middle East. So I don't know that they were, I didn't like it, but I had been denouncing the calls to invade Iraq for some time, publicly, and on shows like Charlie Rose, So, but what happened is the right-wing media got it. And what they do is they lynch you. Remember when they lynched Howard Dean when he screamed?
Yes.
Or they lynched...
But that was the left-wing media that did that.
Oh, was it? Oh, I missed that.
Right?
You mean Comcast?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So, or they lynched Jeremiah Wright, who I admire immensely. I think Jerry's an amazing guy. So anyway, but they take a little clip and then they run it every hour. My daughter was in elementary school, and they were, I don't know, watching some PBS show, but they were flicking through the channels, and all the students go, "Look, that's your dad." And it was ubiquitous. And then the trash talk radio was just, the Wall Street Journal even wrote an editorial denouncing me.
What?
Yeah, as, I don't know, a left-wing pacifist something. It was ridiculous. So the Times' hand was forced
Oh, really?
to respond. There was a lot of public pressure. And so they called me in and issued me a written reprimand. I mean, they called me in to give it to me. It was kind of like the Vatican or something, and for impugning the impartiality of the New York Times by attacking the calls to invade Iraq. And under guild rules, you give the employee the reprimand, and then if they keep violating it, that's grounds for firing them. So they were just setting me up to kick me out.
And so you had a choice to either stop telling the truth about the Iraq War and keep your job, right? Or keep telling the truth about it and lose your job.
Right.
And so that's a big deal. You walked away from the New York Times.
It is a big deal, and I don't want to pretend that it was easy. And, I was in there.
I wouldn't do it.
My hands were sweating. I mean, I'm not going to pretend it was an easy decision. I mean, I knew what I had to do, but I don't want to make light of it.
Right. I mean, a lot of people are, at some point in everyone's life, I think they come to a choice like that, but not probably not that huge where they have that much at stake. And then you did it. Now, do you think it was because your dad?
Yeah. Yeah, because my dad had been a Presbyterian minister who had been very involved in the anti-war movement, although he was a veteran from World War II. He'd been a sergeant in North Africa. He was very involved in the civil rights movement, and he was very involved in the gay rights movement. His youngest brother was gay, so who he was very close to, and he had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 50s and the 60s, and to his credit, he translated that into denouncing the homophobia of the Presbyterian Church, he himself was kind of pushed out. So that was, I admired my father a lot. You don't teach anyone morality; you show them, and that's the real power of the moral life. So I always remember one of the last times I saw my father. He'd gotten a job as a chaplain in a juvenile detention facility. He had huge churches. He'd been very successful as a minister, sitting in a little office without windows in the basement. And I remember walking out of that building. At that point, I think I was the Balkan bureau chief for the New York Times or something, but I certainly knew who was the greater human being. So when the Times offered me that, or gave me that reprimand and offered me that choice between muzzling myself to pay fealty to my career, I knew I couldn't, because I couldn't betray my dad. And, when I walked out of the building on 229 West 43rd Street, I kind of articulated for the first time what it was that my father had given me, which was freedom. That I didn't need any institution, including the New York Times, to tell me who I was. I knew who I was. I was my father's son. And that is the greatest gift you can give to a child or to anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good for you. Now, they say that I don't have kids, so I always want to say stuff about kids, but
I got 4. I might give you one.
Oh, we need one.
That's just a joke to my children. Yeah. It's not true.
We would love one. We need one, especially if they're over 5. Those are the first 5 years are the hard ones. So now the people who are anchors of our pretend lefty news shows today, I would say the people on MSNBC and what have you.
They had me once.
Yeah.
Once.
But they wouldn't take they take those jobs telling themselves, I'm guessing the lie, that, well, if I'm going to do the best I can. Like you could have told yourself that lie. Well, I'll stay working at the New York Times and I'll be as anti-war as is possible inside this system. And if I wasn't here, there'd be nobody pushing, right? So you think that's what they tell themselves, the people who work for the corporation, who push the wars and who trash the progressive politics?
Some of them, and the others are just craven careerists.
Yeah.
Most people at the inception of the call to invade Iraq, George Packer at the New Yorker, these kinds of figures who are running around being Bush's cheerleaders for the war, they knew what was good for their. I mean, this is what the liberal class. That's why traditionally the capitalist elites allow liberals around, because they set the parameters of acceptable debate, and they serve as the attack dogs against those who question the motives and the values of the ruling elite. And when you question the motives and values of the ruling elite, you are immediately pushed out. And the way that you are discredited is by those figures within the society who hold themselves up as the moral voice of society. Chomsky writes very well about this. I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, but almost everything I know or understand about the liberal establishment comes from Noam. But that's their role. And I think a lot of them are careerists, are kind of very cynical, and probably you're right. A lot of them tell themselves, better me than, I don't know, Stephen Miller or something.
Right. So it's got to be some kind of mental gymnastics. Please make sure you're subscribed. Even if you think you are subscribed, there's a good chance you're not. So please check. It only takes a second. And then click that bell. And that's how you know you'll get a notice every time we drop a video. They still won't notify you every time we drop a video, but that's the best we can do. Plus, if you like the show, you want to support it, please become a patron. We give you hours of bonus material every week. And come see a live show. Go to jimmydorcomedy.com for our live schedule.